The envelope on the lawyer's desk was a creamy, expensive linen. It smelled faintly of cedar wood and something sharper, like the air after a firecracker goes off. To Eleanor Reed, sitting perfectly still in the stiff leather chair, it looked less like a piece of paper and more like a sleeping animal. Something that could wake up at any moment. It was Tuesday, October 12th, at 10:49 in the morning. The office of Barrington and Lowe was so quiet Eleanor could hear the low hum of the fridge in the small kitchenette down the hall. She focused on that sound, on the feel of the wool of her black dress against her wrists. It was a dress she'd bought 2 autumns ago, and it itched a little. She'd chosen it because it was respectful, because it was what a 34-year-old widow was supposed to wear to the reading of her husband's will. Her husband, Marcus. He had been a historian, a man who loved dusty archives and quiet evenings. He wrote books about trade routes in the 18th century. He made terrible coffee and brilliant pancakes. He died in a quick, quiet way, a sudden heart attack while gardening in their small backyard. That was 6 weeks ago. The grief was a heavy, familiar coat she wore every day. Mr. Barrington, the lawyer, had teeth that were too white and too even. He offered her a glass of water, which she declined. The ice cubes in the pitcher had melted into sad little slivers. "We'll proceed, then," Mr. Barrington said, his voice a smooth, practiced calm. He put on a pair of thin, silver glasses. "This is the last will and testament of Marcus David Reed, executed and notarized on April 15th of this year." Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. She expected the cottage. Their little seaside cottage in Maine, with its blue shutters and the window that always stuck. She expected his books, his modest savings, his old, faithful Volvo with the rust spot on the left bumper. She was already thinking about whether to keep the cottage or sell it. The practical thoughts you have to keep the sadness at bay. "To my beloved wife, Eleanor," Mr. Barrington read, his eyes scanning down the page, "I leave the entirety of my estate, including all properties, holdings, and residual assets, to be transferred without delay or encumbrance." That was normal. That was expected. Eleanor let out a small breath she didn't know she was holding. Then Mr. Barrington paused. He looked up, not at Eleanor, but at a point just over her shoulder. "The principal property, herein referred to as the vault, located at 77 Blackstone Ridge, in the Adirondack Preserve, is now yours." Eleanor blinked. "I'm sorry." The words came out dry, like a whisper. "The vault? There must be a mistake. Marcus didn't own property in the Adirondacks. We have the cottage. In Maine." Mr. Barrington gave her a thin, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The documentation is quite clear, Mrs. Reed. 77 Blackstone Ridge. It's a unique structure. He purchased it 5 years ago, just after your wedding." 5 years ago. The same year they'd bought the cottage. A cold trickle, completely separate from grief, started down Eleanor's spine. Marcus had never mentioned it. Not once, in all their talks about finances, about dreams, about where they would retire. Her mind raced, scrambling for a logical explanation. A research facility? A secret writing retreat? But he'd called it the vault. Not the cabin. Not the lodge. Asterisk the vault. Asterisk. The lawyer slid a large, tarnished brass key across the vast, polished surface of the oak desk. It scraped softly. It was heavy-looking, with 3 intricate teeth and a round, numbered tag hanging from its ring. Tag number 77. The transfer of all assets and, importantly, the associated asterisk responsibilities asterisk is now legally yours, Mr. Barrington continued, his tone taking on a slight edge. Mr. Reed was very specific about the wording. Responsibilities. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she reached for the key. It was shockingly cold. The metal seemed to suck the warmth right from her skin. Responsibilities? What responsibilities? Paying the property tax? Dealing with whatever was in a place called the vault. The rest of the meeting was a blur. Signatures on dotted lines. The rustle of official papers. The lawyer's handshake, which was dry and brief. 11 minutes after she'd sat down, According to the elegant brass pendulum clock on the wall, she was walking back out into the lobby, the key a dead weight in her purse. The autumn sun outside the law office in downtown Burlington was bright, but it had no warmth. Eleanor stood on the wide stone steps of the courthouse annex, fumbling for her sunglasses. The world seemed too loud suddenly. The blare of a car horn, the laugh of a group of students, the rumble of a delivery truck. She took a deep breath to steady herself, and the air brought her the smell of fallen leaves, of distant wood smoke, and something else. A sharp, burnt smell, like coffee left too long on a hot plate. And underneath it, the faint, clean scent of ozone, like before a thunderstorm. And then she heard it. A distinct, crisp *click-were* sound. It came from her left. She turned, her heart doing a funny little jump in her chest. A grey van was parked half a block down, its windows tinted so dark they looked black. The sound had come from there. It was the sound of a camera with a long lens. A professional camera. The kind paparazzi use. Or private investigators. As she stared, frozen, the van's engine roared to life. It pulled away from the curb smoothly and merged into traffic, disappearing around a corner. But in that second before it moved, she saw the driver. Not his face, but his hand on the steering wheel. A strong hand, with a pale, jagged scar across the knuckles. Eleanor stood rooted to the spot, the cold from the brass key in her purse seeming to spread through her whole body. The quiet, predictable world of her life with Marcus had just developed a hairline fracture, and through it, she could feel a chilling draft blowing in from a past she never knew existed. What had Marcus been involved in? And what, exactly, had she just inherited? It's a strange feeling, when you realize you didn't know someone you loved with your whole heart. It's not just sadness. It's like the ground under your feet turns to sand. But sometimes, friends, life hands us a mystery we never asked for. And in those moments, we have a choice. We can be afraid of the unknown, or we can find a courage we never knew we had. For Eleanor, the journey was just beginning, and it would teach her that even in the deepest mysteries, we can find our own strength. The next step for her was a long drive north, to a place called Blackstone Ridge, to see the truth for herself. Sometimes, looking a secret in the face is the bravest thing a person can do. The brass key felt like a piece of ice in Eleanor's hand, even through her leather driving gloves. She'd been on the road for over 4 hours, the map on her phone leading her further and further from the familiar world of coffee shops and gas stations. The Adirondack Mountains rose around her, not as pretty postcards, but as ancient, dark walls of pine and granite. It was Wednesday, October 13th, the day after her life had cracked open. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Every few minutes, she'd glance in the rearview mirror. A blue pickup truck had been behind her for 20 miles. Then it was a red SUV. Each one made her stomach twist into a tighter knot. Was it the man from the van? The one with the scarred hand? She kept driving, the hum of her own car's engine the only constant sound. The directions led her onto a smaller road, then onto a gravel path that was barely more than a trail. Branches scraped against the sides of her car with a sound like long fingernails. The air grew cooler, smelling powerfully of damp earth and pine resin. Finally, the GPS announced, "You have arrived at your destination," in its cheerful, robotic voice. Eleanor slowed to a stop. A massive, wrought iron gate blocked the way. It was at least 12 feet high, and between the black bars, she could see a winding driveway leading to a building. But it wasn't a cottage or a lodge. It was a low, concrete and glass structure, all sharp angles and grey surfaces, nestled into the side of the mountain. It looked less like a home and more like a bunker. A vault. This was 77 Blackstone Ridge. The vault, taped to the center of the gate, fluttering in the cold breeze, was a small, square piece of notebook paper. Her breath caught. She put the car in park, got out, her shoes crunching on the gravel. The silence here was deep and complete, broken only by the call of a single, distant bird. The note was handwritten in blocky, rushed capitals. Just one word. Asterisk asterisk don't dot asterisk asterisk. The single word hung in the air. Who had put it there? A warning? A threat? A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeped into her bones. She looked from the ominous note to the cold, heavy key in her glove hand. This was her first real choice. The point of no return. She could turn around. She could drive back to Burlington, call the lawyer, and say she didn't want it. She could go back to trying to mend her broken, quiet life. But then she thought of Marcus. Her Marcus, with his kind eyes and his history books. What was he doing with a place like this? What secret had he carried all those years he made her pancakes? The need to understand, to connect with him one last time, was stronger than the fear. Her hand only shook a little as she reached past the note and pushed the key into the heavy lock. It turned with a solid, satisfying asterisk clunk asterisk that echoed in the quiet. The gate swung inward silently, on well-oiled hinges. She left the note where it was, flapping on the gate like a lonely white flag. She got back in her car and drove through. The inside of the vault was a shock of another kind. It wasn't a home. It was an archive. The air was cool and dry, with a sterile, filtered smell. Motion-sensitive lights flicked on with a soft buzz as she walked through the rooms. The walls weren't covered in family photos or paintings. They were covered in maps. Not old, historical maps, but modern ones. City grids of places like Kiev and Belgrade. Satellite images of remote desert airstrips. There were shelves not of novels, but of black binders, each labeled with a code like Project Gulliver or Asset Tracking, 2019 to 2021. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She walked slowly, her footsteps echoing in the vast, open space. In one corner was a desk, sleek and modern. On it sat a single, framed photograph. She picked it up. It was Marcus. But he was 10 years younger, standing in what looked like a Middle Eastern marketplace, wearing clothes she'd never seen him in. He wasn't smiling. He looked focused. Intense. A stranger. She opened the top drawer of the desk. Empty. The second drawer was locked. She stared at it, then looked at the brass key in her hand. On a whim, she slid it into the small drawer lock. It fit perfectly. It turned. Inside the drawer was a manila folder, and paperclipped to the front of that folder was a photograph. A recent photograph. It was her. Eleanor, taken just last week, it looked like. She was leaving the grocery store, carrying a tote bag. Someone had taken this picture without her knowing. Someone had been watching her. And across the bottom of the photo, in neat red ink, were the words, **asset, inherited. **. The word asset bounced around her skull. An asset wasn't a person. An asset was a thing to be used. A tool. A piece in a game. Marcus's voice from 1,000 happy memories suddenly seemed to have a faint, echoing whisper behind it. The quiet historian, the man who hated loud noises, had a drawer with a surveillance photo of his own wife, labeled like a piece of equipment. The recontextualization of her entire life with Marcus hit her like a physical wave. She had to lean against the cold concrete wall. The peaceful years, the quiet love, the shared dreams of growing old in their little cottage. Had it all been a cover? Was she just part of his secret life? The grief in her heart twisted, mixing with a new, raw feeling of betrayal. The man she mourned was a ghost, and now a different, terrifying man was stepping out of the shadows. The lights in the vault suddenly went out. Pitch blackness swallowed her whole. She gasped, frozen. The only sound was her own ragged breathing. Then, a soft, mechanical hum started up from somewhere deeper in the building. A backup generator, maybe. One by one, small, emergency LED lights flickered on along the baseboards, casting the room in an eerie, blue glow. It was in this new, cold light that she saw it. On the far wall, a large map of Eastern Europe she hadn't noticed before. And pinned to a city she recognized, Prague, was another photo. This one was of a man. He had a strong jaw, tired eyes, and he was looking directly at the camera, unsmiling. But it wasn't that which made her blood run cold. It was his hand, resting on a cafe table. On his knuckles was a pale, jagged scar. This was the man from the van. His picture was on her husband's wall. Was he a friend? A foe? A colleague? The responsibilities Mr. Barrington mentioned suddenly felt like a weight around her neck, pulling her underwater. She wasn't just the owner of a strange building. She had stepped directly into the middle of a story that had been running for years, a story she never knew she was a character in. She was no longer just Eleanor Reed, the grieving widow. She was the heir. She was the package. She was, according to that horrible red ink, the inherited asset. And somewhere out there in the gathering mountain twilight, someone else knew it, too. You know, friends, we often think bravery is about not being afraid. But real bravery is what Eleanor showed in that moment. It's about being terrified, your whole world turned upside down, and still choosing to look for the truth. It's about standing in a dark room, surrounded by the ghosts of secrets, and deciding your next move. Sometimes the scariest journeys lead us to discover not just the truth about others, but a fierce and resilient truth about ourselves. For Eleanor, the mystery was getting darker, but her own light was just starting to flicker on. The next move would require not just courage, but cleverness. She had to decide if she would be a piece in someone else's game, or if she would start playing for herself. 3 days. That's how long Eleanor lived in the vault. She marked the time by the dying flowers. The bouquet of white lilies she'd bought for Marcus's grave still sat on the passenger seat of her car, which she'd parked inside the massive garage of the concrete building. On the first day, they were fresh and sweet. On the second, their petals began to curl at the edges, brown and soft. By the afternoon of the third day, October 16th, the whole car smelled of their slow, sad decay. She hadn't left the building. The world outside the thick, ballistic glass windows felt impossibly dangerous. She survived on protein bars from a supply closet and water from the tap, which tasted faintly of minerals and pipes. She spent her hours poring over the files, trying to piece together the puzzle of Marcus's other life. The words were a maze of codes and reports. She read about dead drops and signal protocols and asset extraction. She learned that her sweet, bookish husband had spoken 5 languages fluently and had bank accounts in places she couldn't even find on a map. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, listening silence. Every creak of the building settling, every hum from the air filtration system, made her jump. She slept in fits and starts on a hard sofa, the brass key clutched tightly in her fist. On the evening of the third day, she was sitting at his desk, staring at a blurred photograph of a handshake between Marcus and a man in military uniform. The green glow from the computer monitor was the only light in the room. She happened to glance up, and she saw her own reflection in the dark glass of the window. She didn't see a strong woman uncovering a mystery. She saw a ghost. Her face was pale, her eyes were wide and shadowed with exhaustion and fear. Her hair was pulled back, messy and practical. She looked like a trapped animal, a scared, fragile thing clinging to the legacy of a ghost. This was her darkest point. The mirror didn't show an heir, it showed a prisoner. It was in that exact moment that a soft asterisk beep asterisk echoed through the cavernous space. A single, insistent sound from the security panel by the main door. Someone was at the outer gate. Her blood turned to ice. She crept to the security monitor, her socks silent on the polished concrete floor. The screen showed a grainy black and white image. A man stood at the wrought iron gate. He had his hands in the pockets of a dark jacket. He wasn't trying to break in. He was just waiting. And as he shifted, the camera caught his hand on the gate. A pale, jagged scar across the knuckles. He was here. Her mind screamed at her to hide, to shut down all the systems and pretend no one was home. But a calmer, colder voice spoke up. The voice of the woman in the greenlit reflection. She was tired of being afraid. She was tired of not knowing. She walked to the intercom panel, took a breath that shuddered in her chest, and pressed the talk button. "Who are you?" Her voice sounded thin and reedy in the silent room. The man on the screen looked up directly at the camera, as if he could see her. His voice crackled through the speaker. It was a low voice, tired, but not threatening. "My name is Leo. I worked with Marcus. We need to talk, Eleanor. You're not safe." Against every instinct screaming in her body, She pressed the button to open the outer gate. She heard the distant asterisk clunk asterisk through the speakers. Then she unlocked the main vault door, the heavy bolts sliding back with a sound of finality. He entered slowly, hands still visible. He was tall, with that strong jaw from the photograph, and up close, his eyes were a startling shade of blue, full of a deep, weary intelligence. He looked around the main room, not with curiosity, but with a grim familiarity. "He loved you, you know," Leo said, "not as a comfort, but as a simple fact. The life he built with you, that was the only real thing he had in 20 years of this work." "What work?" Eleanor asked, her voice stronger now. "He was a historian." Leo gave a short, humorless laugh. "He was a broker. An information bridge between people who should never meet. Governments, private armies, corporations. He was the best. And when he left, when he chose your life over this one, he thought he could just walk away." Leo's eyes met hers. "They don't let people like us just walk away, Eleanor. They own you. And now, they think they own you." He explained that Marcus hadn't just died of a heart attack. The network he'd left behind believed Marcus had been about to expose them. They believed he had passed his final, most dangerous piece of information, a digital file called the Ledger, to his heir. To her. "They're coming for it," Leo said, his voice quiet. "And when they realize you don't have it, or don't know how to use it, they'll disappear you, just to be safe." The room felt like it was spinning. "But I don't have anything. Just this place." Marcus was smarter than that, Leo said. He walked to the wall map, his finger tracing a line. He built a final protocol. A dead man's switch. You, as the legal heir, are the only one who can activate it. It would release the ledger to every major intelligence agency and news outlet in the world. It would burn his entire network to the ground. A flicker of impossible hope. "Then let's do it. Let's activate it and be done with this." Leo shook his head slowly, his face grim. "If you do that, you paint the brightest, most permanent target anyone has ever seen on your back. The people in that ledger are powerful. They will hunt you for the rest of your life, which won't be long. You will never have a quiet moment again. You'll be looking over your shoulder at every coffee shop, in every new town, forever." He laid out her impossible choice. Option 1, I can try to help you run. New name, new face, far away. You'll be looking over your shoulder forever, but you might have a life. A hidden one. And option 2, she whispered. You choose to be the heir. Not just of the property, but of the mission. You activate the protocol. You finish what Marcus started. You burn it all down, knowing the fire will come for you next. The weight of the choice crushed the air from her lungs. A life of running and hiding, a ghost in her own story. Or a short, brave life where she stood her ground, but almost certainly faced a terrible end. She looked back at the security monitor, at her own pale, frightened reflection now superimposed over the image of the empty gate. She thought of the 5 years of quiet happiness, of pancake breakfasts and shared blankets on the couch. She thought of Marcus's gentle smile, a smile she now knew had hidden a world of shadows. And then Eleanor realized Marcus's quiet love, the peaceful years she cherished, was a lie. Not a malicious lie, but a beautiful, desperate shelter he had built for them both. A safe house made of ordinary moments, protecting her from the storm of his real life. The love might have been real, but the peace was always an illusion, paid for with his silence. She wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. She was standing at the edge of a cliff, and she had to decide what kind of person she was going to be. The scared woman in the reflection, or someone new. You know, friends, life sometimes corners us. It backs us into a room and presents us with 2 terrible doors. There's no easy way out. In those moments, the choice isn't about what's right or wrong. It's about who you decide to be. Do you choose the safety of shadows, or the danger of the light? Eleanor's choice would define not just her future, but her very soul. It's in our hardest hours that we often find our truest strength, a strength we never knew was waiting inside us, quiet and brave, ready to speak. The next part of her journey would require more than courage. It would require a brilliant, daring plan. Leo's words hung in the cold, dry air of the vault. Run and hide forever, or stand and fight and almost certainly be destroyed. Eleanor stood perfectly still, feeling the weight of the brass key in her pocket, its edges pressing against her thigh. The scared woman in the green monitor reflection was still there, but a new feeling was bubbling up underneath the fear. A hot, sharp feeling. Anger. Not just anger at the people hunting her, but a deep, personal anger at the situation. She had been trusting. She had believed in a peaceful, simple story. That trust, that desire for a quiet life, had been her biggest weakness. It had left her blind. Now, she looked at Leo, his face lined with the exhaustion of a man who'd been running for years. "They expect me to be afraid," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "They expect me to run, or to fumble around in the dark, or to wait for someone to rescue me. That's what the asset would do." Leo watched her, his blue eyes cautious. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Eleanor said, turning to look at the wall of maps, "that I need to stop being the thing everyone is looking for. I need to become the person doing the looking." Her flaw had been her innocent trust. She decided, right then, to weaponize it. She would use the world's view of her, Eleanor Reed, the naive, grieving historian's wife, as her greatest tool. The plan formed over the next 48 hours, a tense partnership forged in the glow of computer screens. Leo knew the mechanics of Marcus's world, the signals, the drop points, the players. Eleanor knew the heart of it. She knew Marcus. She remembered the stories he'd told, the places he'd said were special. "He loved the coast," she said, pointing to a map of Maine. "Not our cottage. A specific spot. Gull's Cry Point. He said the light there at noon was like liquid diamond. He went there every year on October 22nd, alone. He told me it was for silent reflection." She looked at Leo. "It wasn't for reflection, was it?" Leo pulled up a file on the computer. It was a passive meeting site. A place to exchange information without meeting. October 22 ND. That was his annual check-in with a neutral contact. He looked at her with new respect. "You're saying we use that. We make them come to you, on your terms, in a place you're supposed to be." That was the plan. She would become the perfect, predictable widow. She would publicly announce a memorial visit to Gull's Cry Point to scatter Marcus's ashes on the anniversary of their first meeting. It was emotional. It was believable. And most importantly, it would force the opposition to move. They would have to intercept her there, in the open, to get the fictional ledger they thought she had. Leo hated it. "It's too exposed," he argued, running a hand through his hair. "They won't come alone. They'll be prepared." "I'm counting on it," Eleanor said. Her hands didn't shake as she wrote the public social media post. She chose an old, happy photo of her and Marcus, smiling on a beach. The caption was simple, heartfelt, and exactly what a grieving wife would write about a final goodbye. She set the post to go live on the morning of October 21st. The trap was set. The night before the trip, she sat at Marcus's desk. She opened the bottom drawer and took out the one personal item she'd found, his old, silver wristwatch. She carefully pried open the back. Inside, nestled next to the tiny gears, was a microtransmitter, no bigger than a grain of rice. Leo had shown her how to activate it. She sewed it carefully into the lining of her dark blue coat, right near the collar. Her heart was a steady drum against her ribs. Not with panic now, but with purpose. The drive to the coast on the morning of the 22nd was long. The sky was a hard, clear blue, the autumn sun bright but offering little warmth. Leo followed in a separate car, hanging far back, a silent guardian shadow. Gull's Cry Point was a dramatic slash of grey rock jutting into the cold, churning Atlantic. The wind whipped off the water, carrying the smell of salt and dying seaweed. At precisely 11:55 a.m., Eleanor parked in the small gravel lot. It was empty. She got out, the wind immediately tearing at her hair and coat. She carried a simple, elegant ceramic urn, It contained not ashes, but fine sand from the driveway of the vault. She walked slowly along the marked path to the very tip of the point. The sound of the waves crashing below was a rhythmic, powerful roar. She felt terribly exposed. The rock was bare, with only a few scrubby, wind-bent trees for cover. The sun was directly overhead, a stark, revealing spotlight that left no shadows to hide in. This was it. The high noon of her new life. She didn't have to wait long. A man in a beige trench coat walked up the path from the other side of the point. He was polite-looking, in his 50s, with neat grey hair. He could have been a professor or a banker. He stopped a respectful 10 feet away from her, his hands folded in front of him. "Mrs. Reed," he said, his voice calm and carried easily on the wind. "My condolences. I was an admirer of your husband's work." Eleanor held the urn tightly. What work would that be? His book on Baltic trade routes. The man gave a thin, patient smile. "Let's not play games. It's time for the inheritance to be handed over. Cleanly. Quietly. You give us the ledger, and you can go back to your life. Such as it is." This was the moment. She looked past him, out at the vast, indifferent ocean. She thought of Marcus choosing this very spot, year after year, standing where she stood now, living a double life. She thought of her own choice, not to run, but to reshape the trap into her own weapon. She turned her head slightly, the wind catching her words and carrying them directly toward the microphone sewn into her coat. She spoke clearly, her voice firm. "The estate is yours." For a split second, the man in the trench coat looked confused. Then, his eyes widened almost imperceptibly. It wasn't the code phrase to hand something over. It was the code phrase Leo had told her about, Marcus's ultimate signal. It meant the package was compromised, the deal was blown, and the information was being released. From the rocks behind the man, 2 more figures stood up. They weren't polite or professor-like. They looked tense, alert. Their hands moved toward their coats. But from the path behind Eleanor, a new voice cut through the wind. It was Leo. He wasn't hiding anymore. He stood in the open, a phone held high in his hand, its screen glowing. "It's over," Leo shouted, his voice fierce. "The broadcast is live. The upload started the moment she said the words. Check your phones. Check the news. The ledger is finding every inbox it was meant to find." The man in the trench coat didn't move. He just stared at Eleanor, his polite mask completely gone, replaced with a look of cold, stunned recalculations. She wasn't a frightened asset. She was the messenger, and she had just delivered a message that would set countless other lives on fire. The confrontation wasn't a fight. It was a detonation. And as the man slowly reached into his own pocket, not for a weapon, but for a buzzing phone, Eleanor knew the first part of her plan had worked. The fire had been lit. Now, she had to survive the blaze. Friends, have you ever felt backed into a corner? Where every choice seems like a bad one? Eleanor's story shows us that sometimes, the way out isn't to retreat or to charge blindly. Sometimes, it's to change the game itself. She used her own perceived weakness as her greatest strength. She turned a moment of vulnerability into a moment of unshakable power. It teaches us that our deepest challenges can become the launchpad for our most brilliant solutions. The final chapter for Eleanor wasn't about winning a battle. It was about claiming her own story. 4 months later, the cream linen envelope, the one that had started it all, sat on a small, sun-warmed desk in Lisbon. It was no longer crisp. Its edges were soft, worn from being handled. A faint stain, a ring from a coffee cup, colored one corner. A smudge of what might have been sea salt or dust from a long journey marked its surface. It was empty now. Its purpose had been served. Eleanor Reed sat at that desk, looking out through open French doors onto a tiny balcony. It was late February, and the air in Portugal held a soft, promising warmth that Vermont could only dream of at this time of year. The morning light was a clear, gentle gold, and it fell across a simple terracotta pot where a small, brave geranium was putting out its first red bloom. The desk was new, made of light pine. On it rested her laptop, a Portuguese phrasebook, And that empty envelope. She picked it up, feeling the familiar texture. It didn't smell of cedar and cordite anymore. It smelled of this new apartment, of lemon-scented polish and the faint, sweet smell of pastel de nata from the bakery downstairs. Inside the envelope now, she kept only two things: a clean, new passport with a new name, Eleanor Race, and a small photograph. The photo was of Leo. It was a recent one, taken right here in this city. He was sitting at a cafe table, caught mid-laugh, a cup of espresso in front of him. He looked younger. The permanent worry line between his brows was softer. He wasn't her guardian or her partner in espionage anymore. He was just Leo. Her friend. The one person in the world who knew the whole story. The events after Goal's Cry Point had been a blur of safe houses and whispered plans. Leo's broadcast had worked. The ledger had indeed flooded into the digital world, causing silent earthquakes in boardrooms and government offices across the globe. The men who had come for her were suddenly much more interested in saving themselves. She and Leo had a narrow window, a chaotic gap in the attention focused on her, and they had slipped through it. They'd traveled separately, using routes and methods Marcus had documented in his files. Eleanor had learned to watch for specific things: a certain type of security camera, a particular model of car idling too long. She wasn't paranoid. She was observant. It was a different way of seeing the world, one that had become a part of her. She stood up and walked to the balcony, breathing in the fresh air. Her chipped blue door, painted a cheerful yellow by the previous tenant, led out to this little slice of sky. Below, the sounds of Lisbon were a comforting, ordinary music: the clang of a tram bell, the chatter of neighbors, the distant cry of a fish seller. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan. Her fingers closed around her keyring. She pulled it out and let the keys sit in her palm in the sunlight. There were three. A simple silver key for her apartment door, a black fob for her small, unremarkable car, and between them, the tarnished brass key to the vault. Its intricate teeth were still sharp. Its number tag, number 77, was still legible. It was no longer a key to a place of fear and secrets. It was a token, a reminder. It was the weight of everything she had lost and everything she had found. She didn't carry it for safety. She carried it for truth. It was the scar left behind, not ugly or painful, but solid and real. It was proof that she had faced the impossible and had chosen who she wanted to be. The phone on the desk buzzed softly. A text message lit up the screen. It was from Leo. * market today. The oranges look incredible. I'll buy past ice. **, she smiled. A simple, normal plan for a sunny afternoon. She looked from the key in her hand, to the bright door, to the living city beyond her balcony. The watchfulness, that new layer of seeing, would never fully leave her eyes. But it wasn't a burden anymore. It was just a part of her, like the color of her hair or the sound of her voice. She had inherited an estate of secrets and a dangerous past. But in return, she had inherited her own courage. She had discovered a strength that was flexible and resilient, like the roots of the geranium breaking through the old terracotta pot. She placed the keyring back in her pocket, the brass one settling between its ordinary companions with a familiar, solid click. She closed the French doors, locked them out of simple habit, and picked up her market bag. As she stepped out into the hallway, the yellow door closing securely behind her, she was just Eleanor, heading out to buy bread and meet a friend. And that, in its beautiful, simple complexity, was more than enough. You know, friends, our stories don't always end with happily ever after in the fairy tale sense. Sometimes they end with quietly, and with purpose. Eleanor's journey shows us that we are not defined by the storms that hit us, but by how we choose to rebuild in the calm that follows. We can carry our scars not as wounds, but as proof that we healed. We can take the heaviest key, the one that unlocks our darkest rooms, and find that over time, it simply becomes a part of our everyday weight. And in that ordinary carrying, we find our extraordinary peace. Your past, no matter what it holds, can always become the foundation for a stronger, braver, and more hopeful future. You have that power. Go build something beautiful with it.